fried rice, we'll need cooking oil, eggs, ham, mushrooms, green onion, ginger root, ground red cayenne pepper, cooked rice that's been chilled, Chinese cabbage, soy sauce, and a little bit of water. The equipment we'll need to make our fried rice is a large skillet with a lid. We'll need a cutting board, a paring knife, and a chef's knife. We'll need a wooden spoon for moving things around in the skillet. And as a part of the preparation, we'll need some various size bowls and custard cups, a fork to beat the eggs together, dry measuring cups and measuring spoons, and a straight edge spatula. When making our fried rice, one of the things that we'll need to prepare ahead is the rice itself. Because if you look in the recipe, you'll notice that it says 3 cups of chilled cooked rice. So of cooked rice that's been chilled. So we need to cook it ahead of time, and we need at least a few hours for it to really chill well in the refrigerator. And so overnight would be even better. We'd need 3 cups of cooked and generally long grain white rice, which we're using in our recipe today, has about a 3-to-1 ratio in that 1 cup of dry rice will cook up to about 3 cups of rice. And then to prepare a long grain white rice, we need 2 cups of liquid. We need to double the liquid for whatever amount of rice we have. Now I have a rice cooker here, and I really like this because it does a great job. It gets the right rice to just the right texture without burning it. There are a lot of ways to prepare a plain rice like this. You can do a saucepan on the stovetop. Honestly, that's not my favorite because I feel like that's the one that burns the most easily. They make rice cookers that you can use in microwaves. I like those a lot. I've used those before. I believe Instant Pots now have a lot of those have a rice feature, so you could cook and fluff your rice that way. But one of the most basic ways, if you don't have a rice cooker like this, that I really like, is to take a large casserole dish, put it in, cook your rice in the microwave. And so for a long grain white, I would put my rice and my liquid in the casserole dish, cover it with plastic wrap, poke a few holes to vent it, and then I'd cook it for 5 minutes on high. And then without even opening the door or stirring the rice or taking the plastic off, I would simply set my microwave to cook for 15 minutes on medium or 50% power. And you'll get the most perfect rice without being burnt that you've ever had, short of, again, buying a special appliance. So we're going to go ahead and put our long grain white rice into the rice cooker. And we're going to put 2 cups of water, so we have that double liquid ratio. Put the lid on and plug it in and turn it on, and in about 20 minutes or less we'll have some cooked rice that we'll place in the refrigerator to chill overnight. So before I do anything in the way of heat on the stovetop, I need to have everything prepared and ready to add. So I'm going to put things together that go in at the same time. So I'm going to get my eggs ready to scramble. And I'll just beat those with a fork until it's one nice yellow color. Okay. And I'm going to set that aside. And now I'm ready to chop and dice a few things. So these next few things, the ham, the mushrooms, the green onion, and the ginger root are all going to go into the skillet at the same time. So I'm going to put them into the same bowl as I cut them. We're going to start with our ham. And I only need half a cup, so I won't need this entire piece. I'm going to start with half of it. And I want to medium dice my ham, so I'm going to do slices that are about 1/4 of an inch thick. I want to have it kind of small so it gets all throughout my fried rice. And then I'm going to turn those on their side. Stack a few up at a time to make it go a little bit faster. And then I want to make sure that I get at least a half cup. So then I'll take those long bâtonnets basically and go 1/4 of an inch down. Notice how I keep the tip of my knife on my board for control. I'm going to need a few more cuts of ham. Keep your fingers curled back out of the way. And either move the knife down the food or push the food under the knife. Keep my board clean by putting it in the measuring cup. Then once I have a half cup of ham, I'll add that to the bowl and I'm ready for the next item to cut. Next, I'm going to cut my mushrooms. It says brunoise, so I want really small pieces, cubes or cubish, about 1/8 of an eighth by 1/8 of an inch in size. So I'm going to turn my board and go across those other direction, about the same. Probably these will come out almost more minced than brunoise. Might be a little bit easier, but it'll make them tiny. So even if you're serving people who don't like mushrooms, if you don't tell them that they're in there, they may not even notice. Remember, never push with the blade of the knife, always the back, so that you don't dull the blade. So once I have my mushrooms into tiny pieces, I'm going to place it in the measuring cup. I want about 1/4 cup of mushrooms. And then I'll add that to the ham, because it's going to go in the skillet at the same time. So now I'm ready to cut my next item, which will be my green onion. My recipe calls for 1/4 cup of thinly sliced green onion. So I have my 1/4 cup here to measure. I'm going to cut just the very end off. On these 3 you can see the hairy root. We don't want that. This you can see the hairy root kind of left already, but we want to freshen up that cut. So take that off, and then I'm going to peel off the outer layer of the onion. And then I'll line these up. So when you're working with green onions, the majority of the flavor is in the white portion of the onion. So you always want to put that part in first, but then you go up the stem, or up the leaves, excuse me, until you get to the last couple of inches. So we're going to go ahead and just slice, again keeping that tip of the blade on the cutting board, moving the knife down the food until I get to these last few inches that I want to discard. And then we'll make sure we have about 1/4 cup. Could always slice one more onion if we needed it. But that looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and add that to our mushrooms and our ham. And then we're gonna take care of our ginger root next. So I've broken a piece of my ginger root off, kind of estimated what I'll need for a 1/2 to a teaspoon of minced ginger root. And normally I would use a paring knife to take the skin off and then a chef's knife to mince. I recently saw a tip that for ginger root you could take a spoon and use it to remove the peel, and it really does a pretty good job. And it leaves more of the ginger available for the recipe from that piece than the paring knife does. It's a little detailed, but like I said, it works pretty well. And it's not at all sharp on that tiny piece of ginger root, so that's kind of nice as well. So I've taken the peel off my cutting board to keep my work area clean, and now I'm ready to mince my ginger. So one direction, kind of into small slices, and then with the tip of the knife on the board and my guiding hand on that portion over the tip. Notice my fingers are out straight so they don't get caught under the knife itself. And to mince, I'm just going to rock back and forth across the ginger. Knock this all back down so it gets under the knife. Back of the spine of the knife to push together, not the blade. So now I've got this nice and tiny. Let's see how I like the flavor of ginger. So I would really like to get a full teaspoon. If you're not sure, you would want to start out with a 1/2 teaspoon the first time you made this recipe, and then you could always increase it the next time. So that's pretty good. Pretty full teaspoon of ginger root. So I'm going to add that to my bowl. Because again, these things go in the skillet at the same time. And then I can save this piece in the refrigerator for up to a few weeks, and it'll be good for other recipes. The last thing in this bowl is a dash of ground red pepper. So I'm just going to do a big shake. Now, if you like your stuff a little spicier, you could do 2 shakes. I wouldn't go beyond that. People can certainly add more to their individual dish as they're served. So now everything that's going to go in the skillet at this time is in this bowl. We're ready to move on to the next bowl to have ready for the skillet. The next thing I need for my fried rice is Napa cabbage, and I need to have at least 2 cups. I've got about 1/4 of that head of cabbage here, and this will easily be 2 cups. So I'm going to cut down the center of it just to make my pieces a little bit smaller, and then I'm going to go across at 1/4 inch slices, and this goes into my skillet at the same time as the cooked rice will. So I'm going to just take this entire 1/4, and once I cut it and put it in with my rice, so let you see the other side. This would be in the center. And once I don't want this core, so So once I get closer to that, I'm going to cut it out of my cabbage and use the remaining pieces. So I'm going to go turn and I'm going to cut towards the core on each side and get the good cabbage off of the core and discard the core itself. So now that's ready to add to the skillet. Once I cook my, once I scramble my eggs, they'll go in there while they wait to go back into the skillet. So now I can set that bowl aside as well, and I have one more bowl to prep before I turn on the skillet. My soy sauce needs to be combined with 1 tablespoon of water before it goes in the skillet when it's time for it. So I've put a tablespoon of water into this custard cup. And now I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of soy sauce. And I'm going to measure it over a separate custard cup so that I get the right amount. So I want to make sure it bubbles at the edge, which is why it tends to spill. So there's 1 tablespoon of soy sauce. Bubble at the edge. 2 tablespoons of soy sauce. Now this is ready to sit next to the stovetop and be added when it's time. So now that I have everything prepped and ready to go and set next to my stovetop, I'm ready to turn on my first tablespoon. So I have just 1 tablespoon of oil. I'm going to turn that on a medium heat. So that's 5 or 6, and I'm going to use the large burner. Remember, this inside burner is small. Large heats up both circles. And since my pan fits on both circles, that's what I want to use. That's the most efficient, when you make sure that your pan matches your burner. Okay, so I made sure my skillet matches. So we're just going to let this heat up for a couple of seconds, and then we're going to pour in our eggs and we're going to scramble them, but a little differently than I would scramble an egg if I were preparing it for a breakfast. When I prepare scrambled eggs for a breakfast, I want nice, large, fluffy pieces of scrambled egg. But in my fried rice, I want smaller pieces spread more throughout my dish. And so we're gonna scramble these and kind of chop them up a little bit more than they should be chopped up if you were making them for a scrambled egg breakfast. So just let this oil heat up a little bit and we'll be ready to add our eggs. Now that my oil's had a minute or so to heat up, I want to test and see if it's ready. So I'm going to drop just a little bit of egg and see how quickly it cooks. And you can see it's cooking fairly fast. So we'll go ahead and add the rest of this. Like I said, we're looking for a lot of smaller pieces. So this should be a pretty quick process. Really, I think for this dish, it almost takes longer to prep all the pieces than it does to bring the dish together. So the cook time is not as much as the prep time. Now that those are all done, we're going to move them into the bowl with the rice and cabbage to be added back into the skillet later. Now I've added my second of 2 tablespoons of oil, and I'm going to turn the heat back on to medium. I'm going to let that get all over the pan and heat it through. And then we'll add our mixture of ham, mushrooms, green onion, ginger root, and ground red pepper to the pan. And we're going to cook that in the hot oil for about 3 minutes before we add in the cooked rice, cabbage, and eggs. So now that the oil's hot, we'll go ahead and add all of these things. You can hear that nice sizzle. That's a good sound. You can set a timer or you can watch the clock. We also don't want anything to burn, so if we find that they cooked a little bit faster than the 3 minutes, we can go ahead and add those ingredients to the pan. So one of the things we want to do to keep anything from burning is really keep this moving in the pan. Kind of keep it even on the heat. So we want it to cook, but we certainly don't want it to burn. That's never a good flavor. Just about another minute and we'll be ready to add those other ingredients. Now we'll add the rice, egg, and cooked cabbage. Remember, our rice was cooked ahead and chilled. Try to break that up. Get it all throughout our recipe. Now, if we find that it's not breaking up too much, we could always add a tablespoon of water to our recipe, and that would help that rice loosen back up a little. But first, we're going to add our 2 tablespoons of soy sauce and tablespoon of water. And get that all mixed around so that everything's combined well. You can see why you need the large skillet, because even at that, it's hard to contain things. This could also be cooked in a wok if you had one. Kind of break this down a little bit with the 1 spoon. I think I do want to add a little bit of water because I'm going to put a lid on here and let this cook for a few minutes. And I don't want it to burn in that time. I want it to, all the flavors to blend. So we'll add a couple tablespoons of water and stir that around, and then we'll put our lid on and let it cook for 3 to 5 minutes, stirring occasionally. I want to make sure I go all the way down to the bottom of my skillet. I don't want anything sticking. It really needs a couple more minutes, and I don't want it to stick or burn, so I am going to add just a couple more tablespoons of water. I don't want to add too much at once. It's a lot easier to keep adding a little bit than it is to try to cook out too much. So I'll add a couple tablespoons of water and put my lid back on for a couple more minutes. So now you can see our fried rice is all finished. It's ready to serve, and people could add additional ground red pepper or soy sauce to meet their personal tastes. For our Spanish rice recipe, we'll need rice, crushed tomatoes, oil, sugar, chili powder, garlic, yellow onion, green pepper, some red hot sauce, some black pepper, and an option of shredded cheddar cheese. The equipment for our Spanish rice includes a knife and cutting board for the aromatic vegetables that we'll be using. I'm also going to use the mini chopper for some of those. We'll need a can opener to open our crushed tomatoes. We need some measuring spoons and dry measuring cups. We need a large skillet with a lid and a wooden spoon. If you don't have a lid for your large skillet, you can always use a cookie sheet as a substitute lid when something has to be covered and simmered as this recipe does. So before I do anything with the skillet, before I turn any heat on, I want to make sure that I have everything ready to add when the time comes to add it. So I'm going to mise en place, or prepare ahead several of my ingredients. So I'm going to start with the custard cup full of all of the spices and ingredients that are going to go in at the same time. So I've got a little custard cup here. You could use if you don't have custard cups, you can use a small bowl. And my recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of sugar. So I'm going to put that in my custard cup. And because they go in at the same time, I can also add my chili powder, which is again 1 teaspoon. Put that right in with my sugar. I also need 1/8 of a teaspoon of pepper. And my measuring set does not have 1/8 of a teaspoon, so I'm going to use the 1/4 teaspoon, and I'm going to use half of a 1/4 teaspoon. But to be more accurate, I'm first going to accurately measure 1/4 of a teaspoon, and then I'm going to use my rubber scraper to push about half of that pepper back into the container, and then put the rest into my custard cup. So sugar, chili powder, and pepper are all in my custard cup. I also need a few dashes of hot sauce, but I'm not going to put that in the custard cup because I don't want it to make a paste. I'll just add that directly to my skillet when it's ready. And then at the same time that these go in, I need a cup of water. So I've measured a cup of water. I put in what I thought it was, and then I move down to eye level to check and make sure it's exactly 1 cup. So I'm setting these next to my stove top so that when that step comes up in the recipe, I've got everything all set and ready to go. So I've already measured my rice. It's 3/4 of a cup. Most standard dry measuring sets don't have a 3/4 of a cup. So you're either going to use a 1/2 cup and a 1/4 cup once each, or you're going to use the 1/4 cup 3 times. Either way, you get 3/4 of a cup. So I'm going to set that over by my stovetop. And then the last thing that I need to prepare to add at that same point are my tomatoes. This is a 28-ounce can, and that's what the recipe calls for. So I don't have to do any other measuring aside from reading the label on the can. But I'm going to go ahead and take that lid off of my can and have it ready to go. And it's a good idea to wipe off the tops of your canned goods before you open them, so that if the lid happens to drop into the can itself, it's clean and no bacteria or anything else will be transferred. So I'm going to set this aside with a rubber scraper so that I can clean the can out when it's time to add. The next 2 ingredients I want to work with are my onion and my garlic. So for my garlic, I'm going to take 1 clove. So this is a bulb of garlic. Sometimes people refer to it as a clove, and then it gets really confusing when a recipe calls for a clove. But this one little piece off of the bulb is the clove. And to make it a little bit easier to peel, I'm going to take my chef's knife, put it over it, and with the heel of my hand, pop that on there. I get the dry papery peel and their inner peel to come off pretty easily. Now this needs to be minced, so I could use a garlic press. cut off that dry end. But instead, since I have the onion that also needs to be chopped finely, I'm going to go ahead and use the mini chopper, and it'll get that done all at once. So for my onion, I'm going to cut it in half, cut off the top and bottom, and then that makes it easier to get that outer skin off. Anything that's dry looking needs to be removed from the onion before it's added to the recipe. And then I'm going to make that a quarter cut and 8 pieces, and I'm going to put those pieces into my little mini chopper and peel this. See, I'm looking at this part right here and it looks a little dry, so I'm going to cut a little bit deeper into that top. Peel off all the outer layers. Cut that into 4 pieces as well. And then the bowl has to be locked in place. And the lid has to lock in place. Then hear that click, and we're ready to chop. So nice and quickly, that's all chopped up and ready to add. I'll set that aside. My hands now won't smell as much like onion or garlic. And I'm ready to dice my green pepper. So for my green pepper, I'm going to cut it in half. I only need a half cup of this. So I'm going to remove the seeds. I'm going to take my half cup measure and set it near my board. And I want this to be medium diced. So pieces that aren't too large. And I'm going to cut this into 1/4 inch strips. And then I'm going to cut across those 1/4 inch strips to achieve that medium dice. And I can get more control if I keep the tip of my knife on the board. I want to keep my fingers curled back. And then I can add those to my measuring cup as I cut, so I know exactly how much I need. And once I get to that, once my cup is full, a couple pieces I missed here. More cut on a couple of these. So I think I need just a little bit more, almost there, maybe another slice or 2 off of that side of the pepper, and I'll be ready to go. So I've placed a tablespoon of oil into my large skillet, and I want to match my skillet to the burner. This is a nice large burner. Notice how it has 2 circles, and the dial has 2 settings. It has a small burner side and a large burner side. If I choose the small burner side of the dial, only this inner circle will heat up to cook my rice. But since my pan covers everything in the outer circle, I'm going to use the large burner side. But it's something important to remember for efficient cooking. And then I'm also going to make sure that my pan handle is turned in for safety. So in my large skillet, I'm going to cook my onion, green pepper, and garlic till everything's tender but not brown. So I'll go ahead and put those vegetables into the pan, and I'm going to turn that large burner on to a medium heat, so that's a 5 or 6. I'm going to use my rubber scraper to get all of my garlic and onion out of my chopper. Now if you didn't have a chopper, you could easily take care of this with a chef's knife, the onion. And the recipe called for a half cup of onion. You really have to, if you think you don't like onion, I would encourage you to simply reduce the amount and chop it more finely. You don't want to skip it altogether because it adds a lot of flavor to your recipe. Stir this with a wooden spoon to keep it moving so that it cooks but does not brown. We want them to be tender. Our onions will start to be more translucent, and you'll really start to smell those aromatic vegetables. So just a couple minutes with a close eye on what's in the pan. Now when I look in the pan, I can see my onions have started to change color a little bit. If I push on one of the peppers, I can tell it's a little more tender. And so we're going to go ahead and add those remaining ingredients. We're going to start with our crushed tomatoes. Everything goes in, nothing gets drained. All of the liquid from the canned tomatoes goes into this recipe. I still have my burner on a medium heat. Clean that out, get all those tomatoes in there. And then additionally, I need to add my spices, my rice, of 1 cup of water, and several dashes of hot sauce, and this would be according to taste. You could always start with just a little and add more once your rice was close to finished. So now we want to stir this around so everything is well blended. And we want to bring it to a boil, still on medium heat. Okay, I haven't changed the heat at all yet. And then once this comes to a boil, we're going to turn our heat down a little bit to a medium low or a low so that it maintains just a nice simmer. And it'll need to simmer for about 20 to 25 minutes or until the rice is tender and most of the liquid is absorbed. And then we can serve it with a little bit of cheddar cheese if we want. Almost boiling here, pretty close. So this rice is prepared by the simmering method for rice. We're getting a few nice little bubbles. We'll let those get a little bit bigger before we put our lid on. When we simmer rice, we basically combine it with water and salt in a heavy pot. That'd be if it was plain. Bring it to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer. Done when it's tender, and it can be fluffed with a fork. And that's really the same for this Spanish rice, but instead of just water, we've also got it in a tomato base with those crushed tomatoes. So I've got a lot of nice bubbles going on here. I'm going to place my lid on the top. I'm going to reduce my heat to a medium low to start. So I'm going to move it to a 3 or 4. And I'm going to set a timer for 20 minutes. Always set your timers for the lowest amount of time when you're given a time range, because you can always add more time, but you cannot go back and uncook or unburn something if you set the timer too far ahead. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to check this in about 10 minutes. So if you wanted to set your timer for that so you didn't forget, and then 10 more minutes, certainly that can be done as well. So we're going to let this simmer. We're going to check it in about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to it again after that 10 minutes later and see how it's doing. So about halfway through the cooking, we're going to check our rice and just give it a little stir. And this is simmering just a little fast. So I'm going to turn it down a little more from a medium low to a low. We still have a lot of liquid. And our rice is not quite tender. So So we're gonna let that continue to cook for 10 more minutes and then we'll check it again. So at the end of 20 minutes, I'm gonna stir our rice again. You can see there's still a lot of liquid. I've got this on a low heat at this point. I want a little more of that liquid to get absorbed into the granules of rice. So after I stir, I'm gonna put the lid back on and let this cook on the heat just a little bit longer. I still have 5 minutes in the original time range, but I don't want to let it go that long because it looks pretty close and I don't want to go into all this work just to burn it at the last minute. So I'm going to put that lid back on and check it in about 2 minutes. So now you can see a lot more of that liquid has been absorbed. The granules of rice look a little bit larger. This is just about 2 minutes, about a total of 22 minutes on this pan of Spanish rice. I think I want to give it another minute or two, and then it should be just right. So just another couple minutes on a low heat with a lid. So here's what our Spanish rice looks like after about 24 minutes of cook time total. This has a really nice texture. There's not a lot of loose liquid in the pan. So this is just right. I'm gonna turn off the heat and it's ready to serve. The ingredients for our rice pilaf include yellow onion, fresh mushrooms, celery or green pepper. We'll be opting to use green pepper, garlic, margarine, long grain white rice, instant chicken bouillon granules, pepper, bacon, and water. The equipment needed for our rice pilaf includes a large skillet with a lid. We'll need a cutting board, chef's knife and paring knife, measuring spoons and dry measuring cups, a straight edge spatula, a liquid measuring cup, and then if you have a chopper, like I have pictured here, it can make cutting the onion and garlic a little bit easier and a little bit faster. But you could accomplish the same task with the chef's knife and the cutting board. Before we begin assembling our rice pilaf in the skillet, we need to get everything prepped and ready to go. And one of those items is our slices of bacon cooked crisp so they can be crumbled. So I'm going to cook those first and then drain them on paper towels so they'll be able to be crumbled and set aside, ready to add to our recipe at the time that the recipe calls for it. For both the onion and garlic for this recipe, I'm going to start with them on the cutting board with a knife, but I'm going to save a few minutes and some energy and the smell of onion and garlic on my hands for days by using the mini chopper to do most of the work. Just have to peel the onion and the garlic and place them in the chopper. There's my onion. Here's my clove of garlic. To make it a little bit easier to peel, I'm putting the flat side of the chef's knife and with the heel of my hand. A little bit of pressure, and then that helps the peel of the garlic pop right off. So I'm going to put that into the mini chopper and get those ready. I just have to lock it in place. Lock the lid in place, chop. So if you or someone you're cooking for is not a big fan of onion, I would encourage you to maybe reduce the amount, chop it very small so it kind of disappears in the recipe. But you're gonna want at least some of that onion for a good background flavor. Your pilaf will taste very bland if you skip it completely. So now that's ready to add to the skillet when it's time. So my recipe calls for a 1/2 cup of sliced fresh mushrooms. So I'm just gonna kind of put my mushrooms into my cup, and this is a little large, a little on the heavy side. We'll go ahead and we'll use those. We'll set that aside. And then I also need ready for at the same time as a 1/4 cup of small diced celery or green pepper. And we're gonna go with the green pepper. And we're just gonna cut that into small slices and then turn it on its side and cut it across, keeping that tip of the knife on the board to make it easier to control. See how much we have here so far. Almost there. Got a little bit more of this pepper. And now we just need to measure our instant bouillon and our pepper. So before I put the margarine in the skillet, I need to measure out my chicken bouillon granules, and I need 1.5 teaspoons. There's 1 teaspoon. Normally you would get this in a much smaller container, but I happened to end up accidentally with a really large one, so it works just the same. Well, then I also need 1/8 teaspoon of pepper. And since my measuring spoon set does not have 1/8 teaspoon, I'm going to use the 1/4 teaspoon measure and fill it exactly. And then because 1/8 is half of a 1/4, I'm going to draw kind of an imaginary line and push half of it back into the container, and then put the remainder into the custard cup with my chicken bouillon granules. So I have all my vegetables cut and ready to add. My rice is measured. My seasonings are measured. My bacon has been cooked crisp. So I'm all ready to get started at the stovetop. In the same skillet that I cooked the bacon, I'm gonna cook my rice pilaf, so I get the flavor of the bacon added throughout my rice dish. Now I did take the extra grease out, but I didn't clean the skillet. And I'm gonna start with my aromatic vegetables. This is my onion, my garlic, and I also add the mushrooms and green pepper to this. And I'm gonna cook this for just a few minutes until they're tender, but not brown. So there's my onion and garlic. Now I'll add my green pepper and mushrooms. And we'll cook and stir this for just a couple minutes. I have about a tablespoon of melted margarine in here as well. So just a couple of minutes to really get that cooked. Start to break down the texture on that green pepper and those onions. And then we'll be ready to add our next ingredients. So now I'm ready for the next step in my rice pilaf recipe. I'm gonna stir in my uncooked long grain rice, my bouillon granules and pepper. And then I'm also going to add 1.5 cups of water. I'll bring this to a boil over medium heat, and then I'm going to reduce the heat and allow it to simmer for about 15 minutes, stirring occasionally and I'll know it's done when my liquid is absorbed and my rice is tender. And then I'll be ready to stir in the bacon. Now that we have a nice little boil, I'm going to give it a stir. Place my lid. And I probably want to check this in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to set my timer for that. And if I do that 3 times, that'll put me to 15. And then I'm going to turn the temperature down to a medium low so that it maintains a simmer rather than boil. So I want all that liquid to get absorbed by our rice. So it's been close to 5 minutes. Just want to stir it to make sure nothing's sticking. Kind of check the rice and see how well it's absorbing. You can see it's starting to plump a little, so that's a good thing. So now I'll put my lid back on, set my timer for another 5 minutes to make sure that I check it again to make sure it doesn't burn. Approximately another 5 minutes has passed. You can see now that rice is really starting to absorb that liquid. It's only been about 10 minutes. And we're getting pretty close to done. You can check the texture of your rice by sampling a small bite. If it's still pretty crunchy, then you could add a little more water to finish simmering it for the last 15 minutes. I would not let this go. Looking like this, I would not let this go 5 more without looking at it much more closely. So we'll do a couple more minutes, and we'll test the rice and decide if we need to add a little more water. So after a few more minutes, and the addition of about another 1/4 cup of water, we've got this really nice looking pilaf. And now we're going to stir our bacon, our cooked and crumbled bacon in. Now we have 3 wonderful rice dishes ready to enjoy: our fried rice, our Spanish rice, and our rice pilaf. Any of these would be a great side dish for a meal.